Hi everyone, this is Starpath Academy story time. So in one of my previous videos I told you that I'll be talking about um, the high inflation period that I lived through, and maybe in future videos some of the hyperinflationary periods that my father and my grandfather lived through. And what to expect when expecting high inflation. Right. So, Romania had a fairly good economy in under the communist rule. So the people were not necessarily doing good, but the economy on paper and from a foreign perspective would actually seem and look good. And that means that the factories and the ores and some other stuff were actually working and producing stuff. So much so that Romania um, was the only country in history um, in the last 6,000 years or so that ever paid off their debt. And it was during this period. So I just want to show contrast to what happened um, afterwards. So I'm saying this because in our minds, when we talk about high inflation or hyperinflation, we're thinking about like some third world countries somewhere, from people who don't have running water or something like that. That was not the case at all, you know. And God bless those people, and I hope they will be doing better. But I just want to show you that inflation and hyperinflation happens to evolved countries, right? And then when it happens, they will lag, so they will fall back. And then now, from a modern perspective, you would say like, oh, that's such a backwards country. Well, of course it's backwards now, maybe not so much now, but in the last 20 years, because they went through some rough periods, right? Well, some Western European countries or the US were flourishing monetarily and everything. Since some of these Eastern European countries went through these hyperinflationary periods, they suffered a lot, and it shows up until today. There's no way that they can catch the period back. Um, and just it will take many years. And it wasn't necessarily the people's fault, in the sense that hmm, the average man who just goes to work and does his job and so on, his only fault was that he wasn't aware what was happening. So hopefully this video helps in that. Right, so since the 89 and starting in the 90s, inflation happened. So there was a regime change, and many other political stuff happened. I don't necessarily want to get into that, um, because depending on perspective, depending on your political views, there's no need to talk about those things when we're talking about the 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 essence of hyperinflation. So the first thing you'll see when hyperinflation or high inflation is starting to happen is that the cost of raw materials um, are rising, because you would think that it's just oh, there's a supply chain issue, there's some other issues, but actually um, the cost of everything is rising. Absolutely everything is rising. It's just it happens in waves, right? First it's this, then it's that, then it's that, and everything gets its turn. And usually it's raw materials the first, because that has the most potential, right? So iron ore is iron ore, right? No matter what type of period, you know, you're going through or humanity's going through, there will also be a need for iron ore in 40 years, right? So uh, the raw materials are not yet formed into anything. They have the most potential. You could store them indefinitely, right? So that is the first thing that people want to keep or hoard or make up your mind. That's always the first thing to go up. So in the US, I'm not saying that a hyperinflationary period um, is happening in the US, but I'm also not denying it. So you have to be the judge, and time will tell. But certainly the price of lumber went up, skyrocketed. Copper, um, you know, there's you know. So, right, so usually the raw materials is first, and then it just goes down the supply line, the things that are made from that, right? So, tools, like very simple tools, or farms where they use these materials like lumber, houses because they use these materials to build houses. There's a lot of copper wire that's or tubing that goes into building a house, lumber that goes into a house, right? And then, well, the house prices are rising. That means then they also hmm, the hardware needs to go up, right? So and then tools need to go up, and then the salaries need to go up. And usually salaries is the last thing, because I guess companies or who hire people, they don't know. Of course, we could talk like, well, they're just greedy or whatever, but it depends on the company, I guess. But like, let's just assume that they're nice people. They would want to raise um, salaries, but they don't necessarily know that this is a permanent thing. They are thinking this could be a boost and tick up in prices, and then everything will normalize, right? Everything will normalize. It's just this week or this 2 weeks and a month or two. So eventually, you will have to raise the salaries, because the people who are consuming these goods that you're producing, they just don't have enough, right? Enough to purchase anything. So eventually, it goes full loop. Food prices is usually also somewhat last, not the very last, but the governments or other authorities cannot let food prices go up too high, because society becomes unstable. So there's either some subsidy or something that will happen, that food prices need to be a certain level of your like the minimum salary, or these things are like carefully watched. So, but they will go up, and there will be the signs of it will be shortages in eggs, and then shortages on this, and then there's a law that, or there's a rule now, only two have to buy X amount or something like that. So they can somewhat manage these as long as the supply chain goes. But what actually is happening is a loss of confidence in everything. And then usually that is followed by a lot of stress on the families and the people. So people make fun of Russians or Eastern Europeans or general or some other countries that, those Russians, they drink a lot. Well, that was a coping mechanism, right? It was because life was hard. So um, so it's not necessarily that they were bad people. It was just life was hard and you had to deal with it somehow, right? So anyway, monetarily speaking, what happened in Romania was that we had a 4-0 inflation. That means, I'll just say it in dollars so you'll understand better. The currency was lei, Romanian lei. But what would happen is the lei that, let's say, a bread was one lei, actually was around three at first, if I remember correctly. So let's just say a bread was one lei, right, in 89, and then during these 7 years or 5 years, I think it was around seven, eventually it got to the place where um, a, a loaf of bread was 10,000 lei. That means if you didn't do anything and you just kept your savings account in the bank, and you had $10,000 um, in 5 years. I think it was less than that. When the first wave was probably the biggest, but eventually you would only be able to buy one loaf of bread, right? And and it felt normal, and you were happy to buy it. So a situation, one of my family members, and this is a big story in the family. So my family, we come from a poor family, but there was a story where in the bank, well, they were something different institutions because Romania was a bit different, but in the bank they had enough money to buy three houses, right? So three houses, and after this period, they were only able to buy a television set, and I think it was a black and white television set back then. So, and this is a true story. So you would think again, like, this could not happen, but it does, and it does all the time. It's just different country every couple of 10 years or 20 years, right? And that's your reset. That's your reset. Your bank account gets reset to zero. Everything that you saved for gets reset, right? On the other hand, you would think like, okay, so um, what about debt? Much depends on what kind of debt. So technically, your debt would become again worthless. But if you pile debt on, as I said, political shifts and situations happen, and they might allow to for that um, the the rate of the debt to change. So it could go up, right? So depending on what type of debt you have, right? If it's a fixed long-term debt you have, and you're hoping that the political situation will not change, in the sense that everyone will keep their promise, then your debt could go away. So inflation is a transfer of wealth, right? And your rich uncle who saved a lot of money in the bank, will that will get wiped out, and he will become poor if he doesn't do anything, right? And you, if you had a lot of debt, well, you'll be able to pay the debt off with bread money, as long as that doesn't change. Now, turns out it usually does, because the government wanted to kind of wipe out their debt, but not necessarily your debt. So don't bet on that, and don't be so happy about your greedy rich uncle, because if he's middle class, he will get wiped out in a hyperinflationary situation. But the very, very high up people, who the money masters, the the absolute top, the creme de la creme, who have the most money, don't worry, their savings are not in the bank. It won't get wiped out. So just be nice to your uncle. Okay. So yeah. So there's a reset, right, of paper assets or screen assets, or what, how should I say it? So like, it used to be paper, but now everything's on a screen, right? In your bank account or something, like, everything gets reset, right? But that of course brings forward a lot of calamities like supply chains breakdown. Um, Even if it's temporary, like bad things start to happen, right? And you'll have to survive through those periods. And technically, um, the best way to survive in a situation like this is just to have everything. If you have enough shoes for the next 10 years, then you won't have to buy shoes in during these periods, right? If you have food for 10 years, then you don't have to buy food when it's really expensive compared to your salary, right? Because whatever your food bill is might be some percentage, but during these high inflationary periods, there will be times where it's half of your salary. So the way people survived in Eastern Europe was actually, this is still a fact that um, people living outside of the cities have their own little patches of land. So um, they grew potatoes. I remember every weekend or multiple times during the week we would have to go out and work on the farm. Right, it was my grandparents' house, and there was a backyard. Well, it wasn't a it wasn't lawn. It was we were growing food, but I was like that ever since ever since the country started, or even before that, right? So that's just how Eastern Europeans live. That like there is the big city, but there's like half an hour to an hour drive, and you go to your grandma's house where um, as back as you can remember 10 generations everybody was just growing food. Now that is changing now in Romania, right? Because people are buying food in grocery stores. But if they haven't sold the land, they could always go back, right? So that is how we survived, right? The food was there because everybody was growing it, and back then I think somewhere around 70% of the population was rural. That means like everyone had at least one relative or someone who owned a farm, right? Um, and I'm not necessarily calling it like I would say homestead or something, not necessarily acres upon acres upon acres of farms, but big enough. Even today, can people grow potatoes and onions and some other stuff. And the other thing is in Eastern Europe that, or the countries that I I lived in Eastern Europe, is that people don't tend to move a lot. So like if they bought a property, that was probably their grandparents' property, and the neighbors, um, could be your second cousin. So like everybody knew their neighbor, everybody knew what the other guy needed and helped out, right? So the community, the having the community was a must. Like it was absolute must. And in Western Europe and in the United States, people move a lot, and they don't tend to build, um, strong relationships with their neighbors, not even family sometimes, which is kind of sad. So I think that capital, even I mean I'll call it capital, that value I should say, um, was that kind of saved everyone. That everybody knew someone who could help out, and everybody would help out someone who would need help, right? As for saving, your pre-hyperinflation or pre-inflation wealth to through this period into whenever it ended. Um, Real estate was okay. Did I mean it was just it not does didn't necessarily appreciate in value, It was just real estate before and real estate after, right? So if you had a house, and you still had that house. Again, if you had too many houses, or you were, you know, political stuff could happen where you would be taxed at higher rates because you were the bad guy and all this is all because of you, or something like that could happen. So you have to watch out for those situations. But generally, just real stuff, you know, whatever is, it doesn't matter what the paper does or the electronic payments do, it just is, right? The key thing to remember here is that whatever you have before this period, you don't want to sell it during the period, because during the period where there was a lot of um, suffering, I should say, um, things that you think are valuable become worthless, and things you thought are worthless become highly valuable. So things that are highly valuable in these situations is, well, of course, food and shelter, of course. So I would say food, um, clothing. It was periods where um, everyone knew how to stitch and tie, right? Because it was just the supply chains broke and there was no clothing to be found. And there were some weird situations, but um, you know, it wasn't a big deal. Everybody had their little machines and they sew, and so that brings to the other thing is actually skills. Having manual skills that translate to real value in the real world. Being a carpenter, being a machinist, right? Being able to fix stuff. That was, I mean, that was probably the thing how most people survived, right? Because you can always trade that. Sure, if you save your, you know, your salary, it becomes nothing again in a year or half a year, but you would, you know, you would just work month by month, week by week, and you could trade your skills. But I believe it had to be like real skills, right? Back then it was like not many people were working in offices or pushing paper or watching at screens, right? Because those things are good when um, the economy demands it, but in a economy under stress, those become almost worthless, right? So the other thing would be hmm, honesty and just being a nice person, right? So that knowing your neighbors, knowing your family members, right? Knowing what they know, knowing who to turn to, knowing who needs help, right? So I think above all, that's probably the most important, because these things don't happen in a vacuum. So um, these things have major consequences, and political or not, what happens is one thing, but being able to help human to human was the biggest value, right? Because people coming together can live through very bad stuff, right? But you alone, you probably will fail at some point in something. So communities, forming communities was the biggest advantage, right? If you have that. So I would say get to know your neighbors, you know, know your neighbors, get to know them by name, get to know, what they like, and be nice to them, you know, and whatever happens, like, people should be nice to their neighbors and know when their birthday is, right? And it just makes life more fun anyway. Okay, so Yeah. Um, Let me see. What else should I say? Yeah, one funny thing was that back then they printed larger and larger denominations of paper money. So we started from coins, of course, then one lei, and I think the biggest one was 100 lei or something like that. And then it became, well, we need the 500 lei, and then we need the 1,000 lei, and then the 5,000 lei, and then the 10,000 lei. And eventually, by the 10,000, these coins or these other denominations became so worthless that they started repeating the people. So, like the presidents and the historical figures on the paper money, they just started again the same order. Everyone from 10,000 up to 5 million. I think 5 million. So the paper, the largest denomination was 5 million that they went to. And after this period cooled off, and the hyperinflation stopped. So the economy caught back on. I guess whatever happened to the debt and all these situations resolved. Then they just found that it was too embarrassing to have these large denomination bills. So they just said, let's just cut 4 zeros. So that is why the 10,000 lei became again the 1 lei, but now it's called new lei. So the ron, it's called. So that was that tells me into any thinking human being that this was planned out, right? So this was totally planned out. They knew, maybe they didn't necessarily know how much it would take, although who knows. But this was planned out, and we ended up through a 5 year reset or 7 year reset, I believe, to back where we were. It's just everyone was poor now. Everyone was reset back to the the poorest, and now you start again, right? And that happened, and that truly happened, and I lived through it, and my parents lived through it. And things that were important before um, were not so important, and things that were not important became very, very important. So we got to know who you can rely on, right? In the worst of times, again, you will see you will see the best in people and the worst, but not the but you will know, right? So it was a very very interesting um, section in history in Romania, and yeah, everything got wiped. Everyone fell back to the poorest level, I would say. And well, everyone that I know of, many people got rich, of course. Many people got rich, um, and they got super rich, right? So what they did, well, we can talk about that sort of stuff in the next video, maybe. This is getting too long now. But post your questions and in the comments section. Let me know if you would like me to continue the story. Um, Possibly analyze some of the things that happened, and what would have hmm, been a good step in some situations to prevent, at least in your personal life, so you don't suffer through some of the steps that 3 generations in my family we suffered through and survived. And here I am telling the story to you. So I hope you enjoyed it. It was a long video, but hey, subscribe to the channel, and we can have more of these story times. So thank you very much.